Okay, this lecture is about two related topics. One is the rise to power of the Christian right in the United States, and the second is the AIDS epidemic. But my focus will be primarily on AIDS and queer rights activism around AIDS. So the time period we're covering is the late 70s through the mid 1990s. Um, okay, so the Christian right. So what do I mean when I refer to the Christian right? So if you know about American politics, about you know, you might have thought about the role that the Christian right has played around topics like abortion, right? Opposing access to abortion, opposing gay rights, opposing trans rights, promoting what they call, quote, religious liberty, unquote. So the Christian right has traditional views on the family, has generally opposed gay rights and abortion, and is based primarily in evangelical Christianity and literal interpretations of parts of the Bible for political ends. Um, so, though the Christian right rose to political prominence in the late 1970s and 1980s, it's still very politically influential today. We see this, for instance, in efforts to overturn Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision providing for a woman the right to have an abortion. We also see it in the refusal to acknowledge trans identities, to deny trans people the right to use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity, and the denial to trans people of the right to serve in the military, which happened under Trump. So the Biden administration is reversing that. So 80% of evangelical Christians, right, we're talking about the base of the Christian right, 80% actually voted for Trump in 2016. So clearly, the Christian right is not a fringe movement. It holds a tremendous amount of power in the Republican Party to this day. So the history we're talking about is very much relevant for understanding contemporary politics as well. Okay, so what about HIV and AIDS? What comes to mind? You might think about the effects on, right? You know that it's an epidemic. You might think about the death as a result of the epidemic, the way that it affected gay men and trans women in particular. The question is it still an epidemic? So, first of all, it stands for the human immunodeficiency virus. That's what HIV stands for. And acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS. So, HIV/AIDS. So the focus of this lecture is on the height of the epidemic from the early 80s to the mid 1990s, when it had devastating effects on the queer community. But it's important to note that the disease didn't simply go away in the mid 1990s. It continued to impact queer people, particularly gay men and trans women, but it has also disproportionately impacted women of color, particularly Black women, most of whom identify as straight, as well as Black, gay, and bisexual men. So in 2017, though Black Americans made up only 13% of the US population, they made up 43% of new HIV diagnoses. And globally, it's had devastating consequences in the developing world, including but not limited to the continent of Africa. Overall, 77.3 million people have become infected with HIV globally since the start of the epidemic, and 35.4 million people have died. Currently, only 47% of people around the world with HIV are actually what's called virally suppressed, meaning drugs have reduced a person's viral load to an undetectable level. And, a big part of this is, the reason for this is profiteering by drug companies and the refusal by governments to make drugs available to people with HIV and AIDS. Okay, the main ideas guiding this lecture are the following. The influence of the Christian right on the Republican Party meant the government under Republican presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush in particular was very slow to act to seriously deal with the AIDS epidemic. Because of this, the queer community had to find ways to care for each other and demand action in the face of a devastating epidemic that was causing an avalanche of deaths. By the late 1980s, as we'll see, there was a revival of militant queer rights activism that successfully pressured the government to address the epidemic, though the struggle is definitely not over. Okay, so in the context of vast cultural and political changes of the 1960s and 1970s, particularly the questioning of gender and sexual norms, a socially conservative movement with a large base in evangelical Christianity grew in political influence as it sought to shore up the traditional heterosexual nuclear family. Historian Lisa McGurr emphasizes that this marked a shift in the politics of the right wing. Quote, the package of conservative concerns shifted from a discursive preoccupation with public, political, and international enemies, namely communism, to enemies within our own communities and families, namely secular humanists, women's liberationists, and eventually homosexuals, unquote. As gay rights activism resulted in the decriminalization of homosexuality in many states in the 1970s, and the medical profession determined that homosexuality was no longer a mental illness, also in the 1970s, a variety of evangelical churches and grassroots political organizations took on a leading role in anti-gay campaigns. And this newly mobilized Christian right had a tremendous influence in politics, with its deep pockets, its ability to mobilize its base, and not least because it had built a parallel media universe in publishing and broadcasting capable of reaching millions of people. The reaction against queer rights by the right wing is perhaps best epitomized by Anita Bryant. Bryant was a famous country singer, a Christian fundamentalist, former Miss Oklahoma, runner-up for Miss America, and spokesperson for the Florida Orange Juice Commission. She led a backlash in 1977 against an ordinance, legislation, right, passed by the Dade County Metro Commission. So the Dade County Metro Commission is where the city of Miami is. You can think of it as the City Council of Miami, Florida. So she led this backlash in 1977 against providing protections against discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations based on sexual preference. So after this gay rights ordinance was passed, Bryant helped to form a group called Save Our Children, with the objective of gathering signatures to put the ordinance up for a popular vote. On Election Day, June 7th, 1977, Bryant and her group Save Our Children were ultimately successful. It was repealed by a vote of 69 to 31%. So Bryant focused on anti-gay activism because she saw in gay and lesbian rights the coming apocalypse. If gay was good, that necessarily meant the downfall of the straight nuclear family, which all that was good and right in society depended on. So Bryant and others also, of course, pointed to passages in the Bible to justify legal discrimination against people, gay people, which we've already talked about. We talked about those passages in the Bible, in a previous lecture. So the campaign against gay rights in Florida received national attention and helped to galvanize activism against queer rights across the country, including in California with the Briggs Initiative, which was on the ballot in November of 1978. If it passed, it would have made it illegal for gays and lesbians to teach in the public school system. And I should say it's only after a massive statewide social movement organized against the Briggs Initiative that it did not pass, but similar bills did pass in other states. So these campaigns were really just the beginning. The Moral Majority organized, which was an organization founded in 1979 by Baptist minister Jerry Falwell, was particularly influential in national politics in the 1980s. It disbanded in the late 1980s. So through the 80s, it was very influential. At its height, it had 4 million members and was particularly strong in the South. Jerry Falwell was important on the right because he was a well-known televangelist whose program on TV called the Old Time Gospel Hour had widespread viewership. so he could use his TV show to promote his politics. The group promoted what it called family values, which was a very traditional, heteronormative vision of family life. And to them, it meant opposition to gay rights, opposition to abortion, opposition to feminism, and support for prayer in public schools. Another influential group on the Christian right, beginning in the 1980s and continuing through the 2000s, was the Traditional Values Coalition, initially led by Reverend Lewis P. Sheldon, a Presbyterian minister in Anaheim, California. So Anaheim is in Orange County in Southern California, and that was a really strong base for the Christian right, beginning in the 1960s, really. But when the Christian right rose to power in the late 1970s, Orange County was really important. So, the Traditional Values Coalition was based in Anaheim in Orange County. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has actually described the Traditional Values Coalition as a hate group for Sheldon's anti-queer rhetoric. He called being queer, or he called homosexuality a quote-unquote death style, not a lifestyle, a death style. He claimed that child molestation is the real quote-unquote homosexual agenda. And he suggested that victims of AIDS should be forced into leper-like colonies. So this pushed the Traditional Values Coalition to the forefront of the battle against equal rights in the 1990s. A political alliance between the Christian right and the Republican Party's traditional base of economic conservatives made the election of Ronald Reagan, a Republican, possible in 1980. So when he became president in 1980, he beat Democrat Jimmy Carter. So in fact, Reagan appointed the Moral Majority's first executive director to be a religious advisor to his presidential campaign. So who was Reagan? He was originally an actor in Hollywood. One of his most remembered films is called Bedtime for Bonzo, which I picture here. In this movie, it starred Reagan opposite a chimpanzee. I don't need to say more about that. Anyway, he became governor of California in 1968, again in 1972. He was very much against the social movements of the late 60s and early 70s. And that helped to propel him to national prominence, which helped ultimately in him getting elected several years later as president of the United States. What was his political platform? He supported limited government, like a lot of conservatives, low taxation on the wealthy. He was very anti-union. So he was anti-union. He believed in the deregulation of businesses and supported increased military spending. He also supported the growth of the prison system. We see the beginnings of mass incarceration in the 1980s. He was a Cold Warrior, which means he was a leading anti-communist. Because the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Reagan's supporters still credit him with helping to defeat worldwide communism. He also supported the right wing in Central America, which was racked by civil wars in the 1980s, in no small part due to U.S. influence. In fact, the U.S. actually helped to create the conditions for immigration from Central America to the United States to this day because of its support for the right wing, military, financial support for the right wing during the civil wars in Central America. He was also socially conservative. He was against abortion, women's rights, and gay rights. So just a few months after Reagan was inaugurated as president of the United States in 1981, he's elected in 1980, he gets inaugurated in early 1981, the first reports of what would become known as AIDS were reported. More and more people were dying of AIDS in the early 1980s. And these were young people in the prime of their lives. By the mid-1980s, people didn't just have one friend who died. Friend after friend after friend became ill with AIDS and died. And these were young people, that were dying. They were mostly in their 20s and their 30s. And so many people died so quickly that you could call it an avalanche of deaths. When AIDS was first discovered in 1981, it was associated with gay people in the press, which referred to it using the term GRID, which stands for Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. But by September of 1982, the Centers for Disease Control started to call the disease AIDS, so no longer was calling it GRID. Over the course of the 1980s and early 1990s, the number of cases and deaths among people with AIDS increased very rapidly. With a peak being in 1993, there were 42,000 people who died just in that year alone in 1993. The greatest impact of the disease has been on men who have sex with men. And I say that purposefully because it's not just about people who identify as gay, right? It's men who have sex with men, trans women, intravenous drug users, prisoners, and people of color, generally speaking. So here's some statistics to make this more concrete. Of people with HIV and AIDS, HIV/AIDS in 1986, Black Americans comprised 25%, though they were just 12% of the population at the time. Latinx people comprised 14%, though they'd made up just 6% of the population. And life expectancy was also much lower for people of color with AIDS. On average, a white person might expect to live 2 years after diagnosis, while a person of color lived for 19 weeks. In 1990, 20% of women in prison had HIV and AIDS, and currently, 52% of women contracting AIDS are Black. So people of color were and are more susceptible to AIDS, due of course to structural racism and poverty. So let's personalize this history a little by looking at one person, Paul Castro, who died of AIDS. Paul Castro, he was Latino. He moved from Texas to San Francisco after a visit in 1981 when he told himself, "Hun, if you don't wake up at 40 wishing you had moved to San Francisco, you'll be sorry," unquote. So according to his obituary, he packed his 501s and Marabou pumps and jumped into the city as many had before. Right? A lot of people had moved specifically to San Francisco because it was gay-friendly. He fought AIDS for 27 months before dying on June 8, 1985. And he had been active before his death in the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. So I want to read just a couple of lines from his obituary. Quote, "His other great passion was for his brothers with AIDS. As an interferon patient, Paul was on Ward 86 3 times a week for a year. Paul treated the clinic as his own. He lit up everybody's day with a smile, a joke, or a rude comment," unquote. And then the last paragraph says, quote, "In April, his mom, Faye Castro, flew out to join him. She was at his side day and night for the next 2 months. He rallied and fought and was furious at dying, and now he's gone," unquote. So Paul Castro represents the face of the epidemic. First, Paul Castro was gay. He was a gender non-conforming gay man. He was Latino, one of tens of thousands of gay men who died of AIDS. The obituary we just read parts of, was published in the Bay Area Reporter, which published free of cost the obituaries of people who died of AIDS. It was a gay newspaper in San Francisco. So often the obituaries were written by white friends or lovers. In this case, so there's a reference to Castro as a, quote, "cute little Mexican boy determined to make it in an Anglo culture," unquote. Right? This quote comes off as somewhat exoticizing, framing his Latino body as a cute little Mexican boy, which sort of relates to the houseboy discourse and dominant white gay culture, especially in the personal sexual want ads, according to historian Roque Ramirez. So it's hard to argue that the U.S. government's response to AIDS in the 1980s was anything but neglectful and totally homophobic. Because of its initial association with gay people The U.S. government did not provide adequate funding for AIDS research, treatment, and other services. President Ronald Reagan refused to even utter the word AIDS in public until 1985, about 5 years into the epidemic. Between 1981 and 1987, 40,000 people in the U.S. had died of AIDS, right? And for most of this time, Reagan didn't even talk about AIDS publicly. So, AIDS activists targeted pharmaceutical companies due to the high cost of drugs and corporate profiteering on the backs of people with AIDS. So when AZT, a drug to treat people with AIDS, was made available in 1987, it actually cost $10,000 per year. The government also actively supported anti-AIDS bigotry when, in June 1986, the Justice Department allowed federal contractors to fire employees with HIV/AIDS if they feared casual transmission. Mark Harrington, an AIDS activist, describes how he and others reacted in response to this neglect. Quote, "In the absence of adequate health care, we have learned to become our own clinicians, researchers, lobbyists, drug smugglers, pharmacists. We have our own libraries, newspapers, drugstores, and laboratories." Unquote. So this neglect was backed by the Christian right, which had an important hand in getting Reagan elected in 1980. So take this quote by Jerry Falwell. Quote, "AIDS is the wrath of a just God against homosexuals. To oppose it would be like an Israelite jumping in the Red Sea to save one of Pharaoh's charioteers. AIDS is not just God's punishment for homosexuals, it is God's punishment for the society that tolerates homosexuals." So on the slide, I decided to put this other photo here. The one on the bottom is Trump and Jerry Falwell Jr. So that's Jerry Falwell's son, who has been really important in drumming up support for Trump among evangelical Christians. Okay, I'm going to pause there and continue the rest of this lecture in part 2.